Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Maybe because she wasn't supposed to matter here, not in a room full of combat commanders, hardened men who smelled like dust and gun oil, not antiseptic and surgical gloves. Captain Penelope Rogers stood quietly near the back, her uniform sleeves rolled up, a faint line of dried blood still visible near her cuff. The others didn't notice. Or maybe they did and chose to look past her, the medic, the surgeon who patched up the real soldiers. Outside, the sound of distant artillery rumbled like a coming storm. Inside, voices collided, maps unfolding, radios hissing, tension thick enough to taste. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander, spoke with clipped authority. Enemy armored units moving from 3 directions. Battalion strength armor, T-72s and BMPs. They're 30 clicks out and advancing fast. No one noticed that Penelope's green eyes had gone distant, not fearful, but calculating. She wasn't supposed to think like that anymore. Not in range brackets, not in target silhouettes, not in flight paths and missile arcs. But she did, always had. It had been 5 years since she'd worn a flight suit. 5 years since she'd felt the hum of rotor blades vibrating through her bones. 5 years since she'd been Rogers the pilot instead of Rogers the doctor. And still, every time she heard an Apache spin up, something deep in her chest stirred. Something she'd buried under layers of white coats and surgical masks. Mitchell's voice broke through her thoughts. Close air support is unavailable. Everything north is committed. We have 200 wounded here who can't be evacuated. A silence fell over the room, the kind that presses against your ribs. Then Major Ryan Carter, young, aggressive, his voice sharp with frustration, slammed his hand on the table. "We're sitting ducks, ma'am. Without air, those tanks will chew through us." Mitchell didn't flinch. "Our javelins can buy us some time, but not enough." Penelope's gaze drifted to the tactical screen, to the red dots closing in on their position. She could almost hear the rotors again, feel the cyclic under her palm, the weight of the helmet pressing down, the whisper of targeting tones in her ear. Then she heard it, a single sentence that shifted everything. "We've got 1 Apache still operational," said a logistics officer. "But no crew. Both pilots are either wounded or missing." For a moment, the world went still. 1 Apache. 1 pilot short. And 200 wounded souls depending on someone to stop what was coming. She felt it then, that flicker of instinct she'd spent years suppressing. The part of her that once calculated death with precision, the part that scared her because it came so naturally. She spoke before reason could stop her. "Sir, I can fly the Apache." The room turned toward her like a single organism. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Colonel Mitchell blinked. "Captain Rogers, you're a doctor." "I was an Apache pilot," she said evenly. "Before medical school, AH-64D qualified, over 800 flight hours, 3 deployments." Carter frowned. "That was years ago. You're rusty. You'd never get off the ground." She met his eyes without hesitation. "Some things you don't forget." The colonel looked like she wanted to laugh or scream. "Even if that's true, you're our only trauma surgeon. I can't risk you." Penelope's voice softened, but it carried the weight of truth. "With respect, ma'am, you're going to lose me anyway when those tanks hit the hospital, along with every nurse and patient inside. Let me try." The silence that followed was different this time, charged, uncertain. The kind that happens when logic collides with desperation. Colonel Mitchell's gaze held hers for a long, heavy beat. Then she turned to her ops officer. "Time to contact." 40 minutes, maybe less if they don't stop." Mitchell exhaled through her nose. "And that Apache?" "Fueled, armed, ready." Mitchell looked back at Penelope. "You understand what you're asking me to authorize. You'll be going up alone, no support, no wingman, and an entire armored column that knows how to kill helicopters." Penelope nodded. Yes, ma'am, I understand. And you're confident you can employ the aircraft effectively. She hesitated, not because she doubted herself, but because she remembered why she'd walked away from flying in the first place. The sound of her cannon, the sight of what it left behind, how her last mission had been a success, and it still made her feel like she'd lost something human. But this wasn't about her anymore. 200 wounded soldiers were lying on tables waiting for a miracle. Yes, ma'am, she said quietly, I can do it. Colonel Mitchell's jaw tightened. Then go get that bird in the air, and Captain. Penelope paused in the doorway. Try not to die. We're going to need a trauma surgeon when this is over. She gave a small, weary smile. I'll do my best, ma'am. The base outside was chaos. Sirens wailing, vehicles roaring, soldiers shouting orders over the scream of engines. Dust hung thick in the air, lit by the orange glow of dawn. Lieutenant Emma Sullivan caught up to her halfway to the flight line. Penelope, what the hell are you doing? You're a doctor. Penelope didn't slow. I was a pilot first, and right now that's who they need. What if you get shot down? Then you'll have to handle the surgeries yourself. The words were light, but her tone was. They reached the tarmac, where the last Apache sat, silent but alive, its dark fuselage scarred by shrapnel and sand. A lone maintenance chief stood nearby, wiping his hands on a rag, confusion etched on his face. Chief Warrant Officer Walsh, Penelope called. Yes, ma'am. She's green. Fully armed, full fuel, 16 Hellfires, 76 rockets, 1,200 rounds of 30 mic. But he frowned. Who's flying it? I am. He blinked. With respect, ma'am, this isn't a simulator. I know, her voice softened. Clear the area. She walked toward the helicopter. Her steps slowed as she approached, not out of hesitation but reverence. For 5 years, she'd tried to forget what this felt like. And in 5 seconds, it all came rushing back. Her hand touched the cold metal skin of the aircraft. The smell of fuel, hydraulic oil, and scorched paint filled her senses. The cockpit ladder creaked beneath her boots as she climbed in. The seat embraced her like an old ghost. The switches, the displays, the cyclic, all exactly where she'd left them in memory. She exhaled. All right, she whispered. Let's see if you still remember me. Her fingers began moving through the startup sequence, muscle memory taking over. The APU whined to life. The twin engines spooled up, turbines spinning, instruments coming alive with a green glow. Rotor blades began their slow, rhythmic spin. Dust swirled across the tarmac like rising smoke. She slipped the helmet over her head. The display lowered across her eyes, data, targeting feeds, weapon systems, all overlaying the world in shades of infrared. Base operations, this is Apache 1-1, she said into the comm, requesting immediate departure clearance. Mitchell's voice came back low and steady. Apache 1-1, you're cleared for departure. Weapons free on all hostile armor. Godspeed, Captain. Copy, Penelope replied, lifting off. The throttles pushed forward, the rotors bit into the air, and the earth fell away beneath her. For the first time in 5 years, she was airborne again. And in that instant, the chaos below, the fear, the fatigue, it all fell silent. Only the hum of the engines remained, and the heartbeat that matched their rhythm. She climbed into the pale morning sky. Ahead, the horizon glowed with fire and dust, the enemy's advance. Her targeting systems came alive, painting red outlines across the terrain. 12 armored signatures in formation, moving fast. She adjusted her altitude, watching them through the sensor feed. Her hands moved with precision she hadn't felt in years, selecting missiles, checking range, calculating distance. 7 kilometers out. She breathed once. Rifle 1. The first Hellfire dropped from the pylon, streaking through the haze. 3 seconds later, the first explosion lit the desert. Rifle 2. Another missile screamed away, and another tank vanished in flame. Inside the cockpit, her heart rate barely changed. Her voice was calm, detached, methodical. Like she'd never stopped doing this. Target 3, lock rifle. Target 4, rifle. In 40 seconds, 4 armored vehicles were gone. Then the enemy realized what was happening. Smoke trails cut across the sky, tracer fire, and panicked gun bursts. Their formation broke. Tanks turned in every direction, searching for a phantom they couldn't see. Penelopey banked right, climbing above their line of sight. Her targeting radar flickered, more contacts lighting up. She switched to rockets. "Let's clean up," she whispered. 19 rockets rippled from her pods, streaking downward in a fiery arc. The explosions hit like thunder, tearing through 3 more vehicles, setting off secondary blasts. In her headset, the warning tones began to scream, lock-ons, heat signatures, something firing back. Her left hand flicked countermeasures. Flares burst outward, brilliant against the sky. The tone vanished. She smiled faintly. Not today. She dove again, the 30mm chain gun slaved to her helmet. The reticle followed her gaze, and wherever she looked, death followed. 2 more tanks tried to run. She walked her fire across them, precise, efficient, merciless. Then there was silence. Smoke rose from the valley, 12 vehicles gone, 11 minutes. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the aftershock of purpose rediscovered. "Base operations," she said quietly into the calm. "Enemy armor neutralized, 12 confirmed destroyed, no survivors threatening the base, returning to station." Mitchell's voice broke through, hushed with disbelief. "Apache 1-1, that's incredible work. Come home, Captain." Penelopey turned toward the base. The sun had risen fully now, washing the desert in gold. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. She'd done it. She'd saved them. But deep down, as the rotors carried her home, a quieter thought whispered through the calm. She'd also become something she thought she'd left behind. She landed to silence. Not the busy, chaotic kind of silence that meant everyone was too busy to speak, but the stunned kind that follows disbelief. When the rotors slowed and the dust settled, soldiers began to gather at the edge of the flight line. Mechanics, medics, infantry, all staring like they were watching something impossible. Captain Penelopey Rogers climbed down from the cockpit, her boots touching the tarmac with the steady rhythm of someone who hadn't fully come back to Earth yet. The air smelled of smoke and jet fuel. Her gloves were slick with sweat, her face streaked with grime. And for a brief, fleeting moment, she didn't know who she was anymore. A doctor, a pilot, both. Colonel Mitchell approached first, her uniform dusted with sand, her expression unreadable. The colonel's voice carried the kind of calm only hardened combat veterans had learned to master. "Captain Rogers, I just saw the drone feed." Penelopey straightened, expecting a reprimand, maybe disbelief. Instead, Mitchell said quietly, "That was the most precise flying I've seen in 25 years." Penelopey didn't smile. "Thank you, ma'am, just did what needed to be done." "You destroyed 12 armored vehicles in 11 minutes, Mitchell continued. "No support, no hits taken. How?" "I don't know, ma'am," Penelopey replied softly. "Maybe muscle memory, maybe fear." Mitchell studied her a moment longer. "Why'd you leave aviation?" Penelopey's eyes drifted toward the burning horizon. "Because I was too good at it." The colonel's expression flickered, confusion first, then understanding. Before Mitchell could respond, Lieutenant Emma Sullivan jogged across the flight line, her face pale but relieved. "The trauma patient from this morning, the ranger with shrapnel wounds, he's awake. He heard what you did." Penelopey nodded, removing her helmet. Her hair stuck to her temples, damp with sweat. "Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes." Mitchell gave a slight nod. "Debrief in 3 hours, and Captain." "Yes, ma'am." I'm glad you're still alive. Back inside the hospital compound, the noise was constant. Monitors beeping, stretchers clattering, voices shouting orders. The war outside hadn't stopped, but inside, life had a different tempo. Penelopey stripped off her flight gear, pulling on her surgical gown with hands that were still trembling from the adrenaline high. Sullivan noticed. "Your hands," she said quietly. "You sure you're okay to operate?" Penelopey glanced down. The tremor was faint, the kind only another professional would notice. "They'll stop when I start cutting." And they did. For the next 3 hours, Captain Rogers was once again what everyone thought she was, a doctor. The same precision that guided missiles now guided scalpels. The same focus that targeted tanks now mended arteries. When she closed her last patient, exhaustion hit like gravity, but she refused to rest. Not yet. Outside, soldiers were celebrating. You could hear the laughter, the disbelief, the kind that always follows near death. Someone had even started calling her the Angel of Horizon. She hated that. Not because it wasn't true, but because she didn't want to be remembered for the killing. When she finally stepped outside for air, the desert was still burning where the armored column had died. A low wind carried the distant scent of fuel and ash. She watched the horizon for a long time. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "It's not supposed to feel this easy." The debriefing took place that evening. The operations room had been cleaned up, but you could still smell stress in the air, coffee, sweat, and survival. Colonel Mitchell sat at the head of the table. Around her were the intelligence officers, Major Carter, and a few specialists brought in via video link. Penelopey entered quietly, still wearing her scrubs. Her hair was damp from a quick wash. Her posture was composed, but her eyes betrayed fatigue. Mitchell gestured to the seat across from her. "Captain, let's start with your account." Penelopey opened a digital map, marking engagement points with slow, deliberate precision. Initial contact at 0447. Range 7 kilometers. 4 Hellfires fired, 4 kills. Primary targets were tanks, T-72s. She narrated each movement, every maneuver, every shot, every evasive dive. Her tone was calm, clinical, like she was explaining a medical procedure. One of the intel officers leaned forward. "You were taking fire during this?" "Yes, sir. 2 attempts with man-portable air defense, countered with flares and climb." "You make it sound routine." She looked up. "It was, sir. That's what training is for." Major Carter leaned back, arms crossed. "You hadn't flown in 5 years. How'd you maintain that level of proficiency?" Penelopey hesitated. The answer was strange even to her. "I didn't maintain it physically, but mentally, I never stopped thinking like a pilot." Mitchell watched her closely. "Why didn't you want anyone to know?" "Because I didn't want to be that person anymore." Carter frowned. "That person?" "The one who kills people efficiently," she said quietly. "I left aviation because every time I made a perfect shot, I stopped feeling anything about it. It got too easy, too mechanical." No one spoke after that. The hum of the monitors filled the silence, a constant reminder of the world outside still fighting, still bleeding. Finally, Mitchell cleared her throat. "Captain Rogers, I'm recommending you for commendation. You saved 200 lives today." Penelopey met her eyes. "Ma'am, if it's all the same to you, I'd rather keep the details quiet. I just want to go back to my hospital." The colonel nodded slowly. "Understood, but Rogers." "Yes, ma'am. If we ever face something like this again." "You'll know where to find me," Penelopey finished softly. "But I hope it never comes to that." Over the next few days, life on forward operating base Horizon found its uneasy rhythm again. The wounded stabilized, the walls were patched, the sounds of war moved further away. But something had changed. Wherever Penelopey walked, eyes followed, conversations stopped, people whispered her name. They looked at her like she was a myth, the medic who became death from above. She didn't want it, didn't need it. When soldiers thanked her, she nodded politely and changed the subject. When mechanics offered to walk her through flight logs, she declined. She didn't go back to the flight line for a week. But one night, after another long shift in surgery, she found herself walking there anyway. The air was cool, the desert sky endless. The Apache rested in their revetments, silent, patient machines. Chief Walsh was still on duty, working on the bird she'd flown. He noticed her and grinned. "Captain Rogers, I was starting to think you'd forgotten her." "Trying to," she admitted. He wiped his hands. "You brought her back in perfect condition, not even a scratch on the blades. That's rare." Penelopey smiled faintly. "She was good to me." "Everyone keeps asking how you pulled it off," Walsh said. 12 kills, no hits. The pilots are calling you a ghost." "I just did what I was trained to do." He studied her for a moment. "You miss it." Her eyes lingered on the Apache, the curve of its canopy, the quiet menace in its stillness. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but I don't miss what it made me." Walsh nodded like he understood something unspoken. "For what it's worth, ma'am, you saved everyone here. We'd all be dead if you hadn't." "I know," she said softly. "That's the only reason I did it." Back in her quarters, Penelopey sat at her desk, writing post-surgical notes by dim lamplight. Her hands were steady again, her thoughts quieter. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw fire, not from the surgeries but from the desert. The tanks exploding one by one, the calm voice in her headset, the satisfaction that came with each confirmed hit. It scared her how peaceful it had felt. Sullivan's knock broke the thought. "You awake?" "Barely." Sullivan stepped in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "The nurses are still talking about what you did." "They need to stop," Penelopey murmured. "You realize," Sullivan said, sitting across from her, "you didn't just save lives, you gave people hope. You showed them that sometimes the quiet ones, the ones nobody notices, can change everything." Penelopey met her eyes. "That's not the lesson I want them to learn." "Then what is?" "That killing, even when it's right, should never feel easy." Sullivan was quiet for a while. "You think you'll ever fly again?" Penelopey looked down at her hands, the same hands that could heal or destroy. "I hope not," she said finally. "But if I ever have to, I'll be ready." The next morning, a new batch of medevacs arrived. More wounded, more chaos. War had a cruel way of reminding you that peace was only ever temporary. Penelopey moved among the stretchers like a quiet storm, calm, focused, efficient. But inside, something was shifting. She'd faced death twice, once in the air, once on the operating table, and realized both required the same thing: precision, focus, compassion. One took lives, the other saved them. Both demanded her whole soul. That night, as she walked out of the hospital tent, she paused. The base lights stretched across the sand like small constellations. In the distance, the Apache she'd flown sat dark and still, but she could almost hear its rotors again. She closed her eyes. The hum returned, soft as memory. For a moment she saw both versions of herself, the pilot and the doctor, standing side by side. And she realized maybe she didn't have to choose which one was real. Maybe they both were. She whispered into the wind. "Sometimes saving lives means remembering how to end a fight." Then she turned, walking back toward the hospital, toward the only battlefield she truly wanted to win. Because in the end, her war wasn't in the air. It was in the soul. And tonight, at least, the healer had won. Why was the general calling her by name? The message came at dawn, a secure channel, 3 words on the screen that made Colonel Mitchell's brow tighten. "Captain Rogers, video conference ASAP." Penelopey was midway through checking on a post-operative patient when Sullivan entered, tablet in hand. "Mitchell wants you in her office. Right now. High command." Penelope frowned. Already. Apparently word travels fast when a medic wipes out a tank battalion. Penelope felt her stomach tighten. She had asked for quiet. The story had other plans. The colonel's office was small, functional. A laptop sat open on the desk, camera light already glowing. Mitchell looked up as Penelope entered. "Captain, sit." The screen flickered, resolving into the face of Major General Patricia Bradford, sharp eyes, gray hair pulled back, the kind of calm authority that never needed to raise its voice. "Captain Rogers," the general began, "I've read the after-action reports, all of them, including the unredacted version." Penelope kept her posture straight. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm not here to decorate you," Bradford said. "I'm here to understand you. Why does a pilot with your record vanish into medicine, only to reappear when the sky's falling?" Penelope considered her words. "Because, ma'am, the things I was best at started making me feel less human." Bradford leaned closer to the camera. "Explain." "When you're in that cockpit," Penelope said softly, "targets stop being people. They become shapes, heat signatures, coordinates. You tell yourself it's necessary, that it's righteous. And maybe it is. But one day I realized I could pull a trigger without feeling anything. That scared me more than being shot at." The general was silent for a long moment. "So you chose medicine." "I chose to rebuild what flying had hollowed out." "And yet," Bradford said, "when the situation demanded it, you climbed back in. You used the same precision, the same detachment, to save 200 lives. Doesn't that vindicate what you learned as a pilot?" Penelope met her gaze on the screen. "Maybe it vindicates the skill, not the feeling." Bradford studied her. "You don't like what you did, do you?" "I like the result," Penelope admitted, "not the method." Mitchell, watching quietly beside her, finally spoke. "With respect, ma'am, if Captain Rogers hadn't done what she did, none of us would be sitting here." Bradford nodded once. "I agree, Colonel, which is why I'm recommending she stay on the priority roster, if another base faces the same situation." "No, ma'am," Penelope interrupted. "With respect, I'm not a weapon you keep in storage. I'm a surgeon." Bradford's expression softened. "Understood. But understand me too. Sometimes the world doesn't care what we want to be. It needs what we can be." The connection ended with a flicker. The colonel closed the laptop slowly. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Mitchell said, "She's right about one thing, the story's spreading." Penelope sighed. "Of course it is." By the end of the week, everyone in theater had heard some version of it. The medic pilot. The woman who'd turned an Apache into a scalpel and carved up an armored column. It wasn't admiration that bothered Penelope. It was the myth-making. In the hospital corridors, new arrivals whispered as she passed. Some called her ma'am with too much awe. Others just stared. One afternoon, a young combat medic approached her while she was washing her hands before surgery. "Captain Rogers," he said hesitantly, "is it true you took out 12 tanks alone?" She didn't look up from the sink. "It's true 12 tanks stopped moving." The medic blinked. "That's incredible." "No," she said quietly. "It's terrible, but sometimes terrible is all you've got." That night, Sullivan found her outside again, same spot on the flight line, same wind whispering across the sand. The Apache she'd flown sat under floodlights, still bearing the scorch marks of war. Sullivan handed her a thermos, coffee, or at least what passes for it. Penelope smiled faintly. "Thanks." "You know," Sullivan said, "you could be a legend. They want interviews, commendations." "I don't want to be a legend," Penelope cut in. "Legends are stories. I'm a person who made a choice." Sullivan studied her face. "You ever regret it, leaving aviation?" Penelope exhaled slowly. "Every time I hear those engines start up, and then I remember why I left and I stop." Sullivan's tone softened. "Because of what it did to you." "Because of what it didn't do," Penelope murmured. "It didn't make me feel anything." They stood in silence for a while, the desert stretching infinite before them. The Apache's dark silhouette loomed like a memory that refused to fade. Finally, Sullivan said, "You saved 200 people that day. You realize that, right?" "I realize I ended 60 others to do it. Those were enemy soldiers." Penelope looked at her. "So were the ones I used to fly against. So were the ones who probably thought they were defending their wounded somewhere else. The math never balances, Emma. It just stops counting." Sullivan swallowed. "Then why do you keep doing this?" "Because saving lives still feels, and that's what tells me I'm still human." The following morning, a supply convoy rolled in, bringing not just crates and fuel but news. A journalist embedded with the main division had picked up the story. By evening, a headline circulated through the internal network. "Medic pilot STOPS enemy offensive, SAVES 200. There was even a blurred photo. Penelope stepping out of the cockpit, helmet under her arm, dust swirling around her like smoke. She hated it. When Colonel Mitchell showed her the article, she just stared at the screen. "I asked for quiet, ma'am." "I know," Mitchell said, "but it's out there now, you can't stop it." "I can ignore it." Mitchell smiled faintly. "That's something most people can't do. That's why you're different." Different, the word echoed. Once it had meant gifted, now it just meant alone. That evening, she returned to the hospital tent to check vitals on a patient, a young private who'd taken shrapnel to the chest. He opened his eyes as she adjusted the monitors. "Ma'am," he rasped, "you're the pilot, right?" Penelope sighed. "I'm your doctor." "But you flew," he insisted. "They said you saved us." "I did what anyone would have done." The private smiled weakly. "No, ma'am, not everyone could." She sat by his bed for a moment, watching his breathing steady. His eyes drifted closed, exhausted. And she realized something she hadn't before. These soldiers didn't see her as a killer. They saw her as proof that survival was possible. Maybe the myth had a use after all. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of the hospital resumed. The hum of generators, the metallic tang of antiseptic, the soft click of surgical tools. Outside, war continued in distant echoes. But inside, life persisted. That was enough. Until one night, Mitchell called her again. "Walk with me." They crossed the quiet base together, moonlight glinting off sandbags and barbed wire. "I got new orders for you," Mitchell said. "Rotation back stateside in 3 weeks." Penelope blinked. "I wasn't expecting that." "You've done more than enough here. Headquarters wants you teaching trauma surgery, training the next wave." Penelope nodded slowly. "I'll go where I'm needed." Mitchell glanced at her. "You know, Rogers, what you did, it wasn't just flying. It was leadership. You made an impossible call, and everyone here's alive because of it." Penelope looked out toward the horizon. "I didn't lead, ma'am. I reacted. Leadership is what comes after when you live with what you've done." The colonel smiled faintly. "That's why you're good at it." Her last weeks on base passed quietly. The soldiers stopped whispering and started simply nodding when they saw her, respect replacing awe. The story still lived, but it no longer belonged to gossip. It had become something quieter, reverent. One evening, as she packed her few belongings, Sullivan appeared in the doorway. "You ready to go home?" Penelope smiled. "Home's a strange word." Sullivan stepped closer. "You know they're going to keep talking about you, right? Years from now." "Then let them talk," Penelope said. "As long as they remember the hospital, not the helicopter." Sullivan hesitated. "Do you ever think you'll fly again?" Penelope closed the last case on her bunk. "I hope I won't have to, but if someone's life depends on it, I'll know what to do." That night she walked to the edge of the airfield one final time. The Apache stood in silence, dark against the stars. She touched the hull of the one she'd flown. The metal was cool beneath her palm. "Thank you," she whispered. Chief Walsh's voice came from behind her. You talking to her or to yourself, ma'am? Both. He grinned. That bird flies like a dream now. The new crew says it handles smoother than anything else on base. Guess you knocked the rust off. Penelopey smiled. Maybe she knocked it off me. He nodded. For what it's worth, Captain, you gave a lot of people their lives back. Not just the wounded, the rest of us too. She looked at him. Then maybe that's enough. Walsh offered a small salute. Safe flight home, ma'am. Take care of her, Chief. Always. As she walked away, the wind picked up, carrying the faint hum of engines from somewhere beyond the dunes. She paused, listening. For a heartbeat, she could almost believe it was her bird lifting off again. Then she smiled, a quiet, tired smile, and turned toward the hospital lights. Because sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is walk away from the weapon. Why did the applause feel wrong? Captain Penelopey Rogers stood on a stage she never wanted to be on, in a hangar lined with flags and cameras. The war was still burning half a world away, but here, back stateside, it smelled of polished floors and forced celebration. The general finished her speech. For exceptional courage and decisive action under fire, Captain Rogers prevented catastrophic loss of life. A medal glinted in the light as it was pinned to her uniform. The crowd rose to its feet, reporters flashed cameras, soldiers clapped, someone shouted, "Hero." Penelopey managed a polite smile. Inside, it felt like sandpaper against her chest. Because she hadn't done it for glory. She'd done it to stop the dying. And yet now the moment was being packaged, rehearsed, retold. A story trimmed clean of blood and hesitation. When the ceremony ended, she escaped through a side corridor, boots echoing on the concrete. Outside, the winter air bit through her jacket. She stood alone beside the flight line, watching jets roar overhead, each one disappearing into the clouds like ghosts of a past she couldn't quite bury. She whispered to no one, "I didn't save them because I could fly. I saved them because no one else could." But that distinction never made the headlines. 2 weeks later, the Army assigned her to Walter Reed Military Medical Center. Not the battlefield kind of medicine, but clean, bright, fluorescent halls filled with recovery and reconstruction. She walked the wards daily, checking charts, talking softly to soldiers relearning how to walk, to breathe, to live. Here the war was quieter, but not gentler. At night, she'd sometimes stop by the hospital's rooftop helipad. The city lights below looked like tracer fire frozen in time, and when a medevac chopper landed, the smell of JP-8 fuel would twist something deep inside her, a mixture of nostalgia and guilt. She never went near the controls again. She always stood back, hands folded behind her, the disciplined posture of someone pretending not to ache. The interviews began soon after. Public affairs officers wanted to capture her story. Networks wanted her on air. Even the Pentagon's media office called, suggesting a documentary about women in combat. Penelopey said no to all of them. But the story had a life of its own. Articles, podcasts, speeches at academies, each version turning her more myth than woman. The doctor who flew, the angel of horizon. Her colleagues in the hospital treated her with a strange mix of awe and caution. Some respected her. Others avoided her, unsure whether to salute or to whisper. One night after a 12-hour shift in surgery, a young resident approached her. "Ma'am, is it true what they say, that you took down a whole armored column alone?" Penelopey didn't look up from the chart she was signing. "It's true the column stopped moving, but I didn't do it alone. I had 200 reasons to succeed." The resident smiled nervously, unsure if it was a joke. It was. Weeks passed. The rhythm of medicine steadied her again, until the day an envelope arrived in her locker. Official memorandum, Department of the Army Personnel Assignment. She unfolded it, reading the words twice. "Captain Rogers is requested for evaluation by the Army Aviation Center, Fort Rucker, Alabama, for advisory consultation on emergency reactivation protocols. She sighed, of course. Fort Rucker looked the same as she remembered it. Red clay runways, training fields stretching under a southern sun, the low thrum of rotor blades that never stopped. The commanding officer greeted her with a firm handshake. "Captain Rogers, appreciate you coming. We're reviewing procedures for pilot shortages under combat conditions. You're a case study." "Happy to help, sir," she said evenly. He led her to a classroom filled with flight instructors. On the screen was grainy drone footage, the same battle she'd lived through. 12 flashes of fire across desert sand. Her own engagement. A major paused the video mid-explosion. "You see that? That's textbook fire control. Lateral offset ripple sequence. Perfect execution. Captain, how did you manage that after 5 years away from the seat?" She stared at the screen. The helicopter in the feed looked alien, impersonal. "You don't forget the feel," she said. "You just forget what it costs." They waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. After the briefing, one instructor followed her outside. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, "I trained cadets who cry the first time they take live fire. You make it sound surgical." "It is," she replied. "Every movement has a consequence. I just learned to choose which ones to live with." He hesitated, then nodded, understanding more in silence than words. That night she sat alone in the base cafeteria, untouched food on her tray. Through the window, Apache sat lined in rows under floodlights, sleek, beautiful, predatory. Once they'd felt like freedom. Now they looked like temptation. She thought about how easy it would be, a walk across the tarmac, a cockpit waiting. Muscle memory would take care of the rest. And then she imagined the faces of the patients at Horizon, the ones she'd saved after she landed. The laughter of nurses, the quiet gratitude. She pushed the tray away. "No," she whispered, "not again." When she returned to Washington, another surprise awaited. An invitation to speak at the Military Medical Academy. Mitchell had endorsed it. "Tell them the truth," the colonel had written, "not the legend." So Penelopey stood before a room full of cadets and future surgeons, uniforms crisp, eyes bright. She didn't use slides or charts, just her voice. "You've all read the reports," she began. "You know the numbers. What those numbers don't tell you is how quiet it gets after the shooting stops, how the silence weighs more than the explosions ever did." She paced slowly. "I left flying because I needed to feel again. Medicine gave that back to me, but war has a cruel symmetry. It finds whatever you try to leave behind. That day, I didn't want to kill anyone. I just didn't want 200 men and women in my care to die without a chance, so I made a trade." She looked at the audience. Every soldier makes that trade differently. Some trade comfort for courage. Some trade innocence for survival. Mine was trading peace for time, time for others to live. A cadet raised a hand. "Ma'am, do you think what you did was right?" Penelopey paused. "Necessary," she said softly. "Right is something philosophers decide later." After the lecture, the dean approached her. "You know, Captain, you could teach here permanently. These students would follow you anywhere." She smiled faintly. "They shouldn't follow me. They should learn from me, then do better." That evening she sat in her apartment overlooking the Potomac. City lights shimmered across the water. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed, a routine medevac. The sound filled the room for a few seconds, then faded. She realized she wasn't trembling anymore when she heard it, just listening. Maybe that was progress. Weeks turned into months. She adapted to the rhythm of civilian teaching and hospital work, but the story of Horizon refused to fade. Letters arrived from soldiers she'd never met, thank you notes, poems, drawings from kids whose parents had served. She kept them all in a wooden box, not because she needed reminders, but because they grounded the part of her that still doubted she'd done enough good to balance the killing. One night Sullivan called from overseas. The line crackled with distance. Hey, hero. Penelope laughed softly. Don't start. We just wanted you to know, Sullivan said. One of the soldiers you saved, Private Marquez, made it back to duty. He asked me to tell you he owes you his life. Penelope stared at the window, watching the city blur. He doesn't owe me anything. We all just borrowed time from the same moment. You ever going to forgive yourself for surviving? Working on it, Penelope whispered. The next morning she arrived early at the hospital. A trauma alert was already paging through the intercom, vehicle rollover, multiple criticals inbound. Instinct took over. Gloves snapped. Orders flew. The operating room became her cockpit again, only this time her weapons were scalpels and sutures. 3 hours later the patient stabilized. She leaned back, sweat dripping, exhaustion cutting deep but clean. And for the first time in months she felt something pure peace. Sullivan's words echoed in her memory. Forgive yourself for surviving. Maybe that's what healing really was. That night she sat on her balcony with a mug of coffee gone cold. The city hummed below. Somewhere, someone was telling her story again. On a screen, in a classroom, maybe around a bar table in a base she'd never see. She couldn't control that. All she could control was what came next. She picked up a pen and began writing. Not a report, not a memo, but a letter. To whoever would come after her. If you ever find yourself faced with a choice between saving lives and taking them, remember this. Both require courage, but only one will let you sleep afterward. She folded the paper, slipped it into the wooden box with the others, and finally allowed herself to exhale. Later, as she prepared for bed, the hum of another helicopter drifted through the window, low, distant, steady. She listened until it disappeared. Then she smiled, not with pride but with understanding. Because she finally realized something that had eluded her for years. She hadn't chosen between pilot and doctor. She'd chosen between destruction and creation had won. And that, she thought, was enough. Why did her hands start shaking again? The hospital was quiet when the call came, 02:13, the kind of hour when even the city seems to hold its breath. Penelope was reviewing post-op notes when her phone buzzed with a secure code she hadn't seen in months. Horizon incident, priority recall. Her pulse spiked before her thoughts could catch up. She read the message twice, then she whispered, "No, not again." By 07:00 she was in a Pentagon briefing room. The fluorescent lights hummed, the air too cold, the faces around the table all too serious. Colonel Mitchell was there, flown in overnight, her expression carved from stone. A major gestured to a digital map on the wall. 3 days ago, an Allied field hospital was overrun in Sector 9. Similar setup to Horizon. Light defenses, heavy wounded, no air cover. Penelope felt the old chill crawl up her spine. Casualties. Still counting, Mitchell said quietly. But there's more. Intelligence intercepted chatter, enemy armor regrouping. Command wants contingency plans if it happens again. The major clicked to another slide. They're asking us to help design an emergency defense protocol, something that integrates aviation assets into medical zones. And Captain Rogers, they want your input. My input. Mitchell met her eyes. You're the only one who's lived it. Penelope exhaled. So we're turning my worst day into a training manual. No, Mitchell said softly. We're turning it into survival. For 2 weeks, Penelope lived inside simulation rooms. Tactical screens replaced operating tables. Pilots, medics, and logisticians studied every second of her engagement. The footage replayed endlessly, her own voice calm over comms, the explosions like distant thunder. Every time the feed reached the 12th kill, she looked away. But something new began to take shape, a doctrine that could save others. Automated evacuation routes, hardened field wards, emergency pilot cross-training for medics. systems designed so no one would ever have to do what she did. That became her mission. If she couldn't erase the past, she could at least prevent its repetition. One evening, after another 12-hour strategy session, she found herself alone in the simulation hangar. The lights were low. A single Apache sat under a tarp at the far end, not hers, but identical. She walked closer, boots echoing on the concrete. Her reflection stared back from the canopy glass, older now, steadier. Her hand hovered near the handle, then dropped. "I'm not you anymore," she whispered. Behind her, a voice said, "Maybe not, but you're still what you learned from it." Mitchell stepped into the dim light, carrying 2 coffees. Couldn't sleep either. Penelopey accepted the cup. "You ever get tired of seeing the same footage?" "Every damn day." They stood side by side, the helicopter looming before them like a relic from another life. Mitchell sipped. "You know, Rogers, when I sent that authorization back at Horizon, I thought I'd signed your death warrant. I watched that drone feed praying you'd miss, praying it'd be quick. I didn't expect to see perfection." Penelopey stared at the machine. "Perfection's overrated. It comes with ghosts." Mitchell's tone softened. "And yet those ghosts built a safer world for everyone else. You call it guilt. I call it purpose." Penelopey looked down at the coffee cooling in her hands. "Maybe they're the same thing." Weeks later, the new doctrine was approved, Operation Guardian Line. Her name was buried deep in the credits, exactly how she wanted it. The press never knew. The medics on the next front line never would. But one night, as she reviewed the final draft, she got another message, not from command this time, but from Sullivan. "Pen, one of ours went down. A medevac bird, enemy fire, they're pinned." Penelopey's heart stilled. "Sector 9, the same coordinates. They need an extraction pilot." She typed the words before she could think. "Tell them I'm on my way." 20 hours later, she was back in desert heat. Different base, same smell, dust, oil, fear. Mitchell met her on the tarmac. "You sure about this?" "No," Penelopey admitted, "but I wasn't sure last time either." The Apache waiting for her gleamed under the sun. She ran her hand along the fuselage, muscle memory snapping back into place. The maintenance crew stepped aside silently. She climbed in. The cockpit came alive around her, systems booting, rotors engaging, a familiar vibration settling into her bones. This time she wasn't alone. A young warrant officer sat in the back seat, eyes wide with nervous energy. "Ma'am, I've read your file. It's an honor." "Let's make sure it's not a eulogy," she said, adjusting her helmet. "Call sign Raven 2-3. Let's move." The desert stretched endless beneath them. Radio chatter crackled. The downed medevac's coordinates, the sound of distant gunfire, the urgency in every voice. They arrived in under 15 minutes. Smoke marked the crash site, the helicopter half buried, pinned under debris, surrounded by scattered enemy trucks. Small arms fire stitched the sand around them. "Raven 2-3, eyes on," she said. "Engaging perimeter." The young co-pilot hesitated. "Ma'am, you're cleared only for overwatch, not." "Noted," she said, switching to the gun. "Engaging perimeter." The 30mm cannon roared. The rounds walked across the dunes, shredding the trucks, scattering fighters. Through the scope, she saw 2 wounded medics crawling clear of the wreckage. She felt the old rhythm again, precision, distance, control, and hated how natural it still was. "Extraction team, you're clear," she said over the comm. "Move now." Within minutes, armored transports rolled in. Medics pulled the wounded aboard, and the convoy peeled away. As she covered their retreat, the young co-pilot whispered, "They're safe." Penelopey exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. "Then we're done." Back at base, the relief was palpable. Soldiers cheered as the convoy rolled in intact. The rescued medevac crew saluted her with bandaged arms, tears cutting through the grime on their faces. Penelopey climbed down from the cockpit, her boots sinking into the sand. She looked at them, the same gratitude she'd seen before, the same unbearable weight behind it. One of the rescued medics, barely 20, stepped forward. "Ma'am, they told us you weren't supposed to fly anymore." "I wasn't," she said softly, "but rules don't mean much when lives are on the line." He nodded, eyes wet. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she replied. "Thank whoever's next, because next time it shouldn't have to be me." Later, Mitchell found her sitting on a crate outside the hangar, still in flight gear, staring at her hands. "Hell of a day," Mitchell said, lowering herself beside her. "Feels like déjà vu. Except this time, you didn't go up alone." Penelope smiled faintly. "That's progress." Mitchell studied her. "You realize what you just did, right? You closed your own loop, horizon to here, you faced it and came back different." "Maybe," Penelope said. "Or maybe I just proved I'm still capable of both sides of myself." "And that bothers you." "It humbles me," she said. "I thought I'd buried the pilot. Turns out she was just waiting for permission." Mitchell nodded slowly. "That's not a weakness, that's balance." Penelope looked toward the horizon. The sun was setting, the desert burning orange. "Balance," she repeated. "That's all any of us are chasing." That night she couldn't sleep. She wandered to the edge of the flight line, the air cool against her face. The Apache she'd flown sat under the floodlights, its metal skin gleaming faintly. She thought about everything it represented: destruction, salvation, paradox. And for the first time, she didn't turn away. She whispered, "We did it right this time." Then she left it there, walking back toward the barracks as dawn began to rise. When she returned to Washington a week later, she submitted her after-action report with a single line in the remarks section. "No kills recorded, all personnel recovered alive." It was her proudest statistic. Months passed. She resumed her post in medicine, teaching, operating, living. The nightmares faded. The tremors stopped. When people recognized her name, it didn't sting anymore. It just reminded her that sometimes stories outlive pain. One evening, after a long day in the trauma unit, she found a letter on her desk. No sender, just 2 words on the envelope: "Thank you." Inside was a photo, a group of medics standing beside a helicopter, smiling. The same crew she'd rescued. On the back, someone had written, "Because you showed us what courage looks like when it's quiet." She read it twice, then set it gently in her wooden box beside the others. As the night deepened, she sat by her window watching the sky. A flight of Apache passed in formation, their lights tiny against the stars. Once, that sight would have haunted her. Now it only reminded her of the truth she'd spent years learning. She wasn't defined by what she'd destroyed. She was defined by what she'd protected. Penelope Rogers closed her eyes and let the sound of the helicopters fade. Somewhere out there, others were carrying on: pilots, medics, soldiers, all doing their best to walk the same narrow line between necessity and mercy. And maybe that was enough. Because sometimes redemption isn't found in turning away from who you were. It's found in learning when to become that person again, only to save others from ever having to. Why did the girl's voice sound so familiar? "Captain Rogers." Penelope looked up from the operating room checklist. A young lieutenant stood in the doorway, thin, nervous, fresh out of flight school. Brown hair in a tight bun, green eyes bright with a kind of hunger Penelope recognized immediately. "Yes. I'm Lieutenant Kira Ellis, ma'am. I just started the Joint Trauma Aviation course. They told me you'd be mentoring us." Penelope nodded. "Then I suppose I am." The lieutenant hesitated. "I read about Horizon. I read everything about you." Penelope froze halfway through signing a chart. "Everything?" "Yes, ma'am." Kira's voice carried reverence and innocence in equal measure. "You were a surgeon and a pilot. That's what I want to be, a medic who can fly." Penelope's pen paused mid-stroke. The words landed heavier than the girl realized. You don't want to be me, Lieutenant, she said quietly. You want to be better. Kira blinked, confused. But you saved 200 people. Penelope met her eyes. I also destroyed 12 others. Never forget both sides of that number. The new course was her idea, integrated combat medicine. Students spent mornings in the OR, afternoons in simulators, learning how to think like pilots and doctors at once. It was practical, efficient, life-saving, and for Penelope it was exhausting. Each time she watched a trainee pull a simulated trigger, she saw herself again, 5 years younger, calculating trajectories through smoke. Tell them. Never let the machine make the decision for you. Some listened, some didn't. Kira Ellis was one of the latter, bright, fearless, sometimes too much of both. During one training run, the simulator room glowed with desert light projected across its walls. Kira's voice crackled over comms. Target acquired, range 7,200 meters. Permission to engage. Penelope stood beside the console. Permission denied. You're not under fire, find another solution. But ma'am, the scenario isn't real, Penelope cut in. People are. Afterward, Kira confronted her in the hallway. Ma'am, with respect, if we hesitate out there, people die. Penelope stopped, turning slowly. If you stop feeling out there, people still die just on the inside. Don't confuse efficiency with courage. Kira didn't respond, but Penelope saw the conflict in her eyes, the same one she'd carried for years. That night, Penelope sat alone in her office, reviewing simulation data. Through the window, she could see the real flight line beyond the training field. Rotors turned in the dusk, gold light glinting off canopies. A familiar rhythm pulsed in her chest. She remembered being Kira once, young, certain, unscarred. Back then, she'd believed skill was the same as purpose. Now she knew better. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Kira again, holding a flight helmet under her arm. Ma'am, you said to understand the machine before you fight it. I thought maybe you'd fly the simulator with me. Penelope studied her. You think flying will teach you courage? No, ma'am, I think flying with you will. Something in the girl's honesty disarmed her. Penelope gestured to the seat across the desk. Sit down, Lieutenant. Kira obeyed, setting the helmet gently on the table. You read my record, Penelope began. What did it make you feel? Pride, Kira admitted, and envy. Envy. I want to be that capable. Penelope leaned back. Capability isn't the same as peace. You can master every system, every skill, but if you do know why you're using them, they'll own you. Kira hesitated. Is that what happened to you? Penelope looked past her toward the dark window. For a while, yes, until one day the sky went quiet and I realized I didn't know who I was without the noise. The younger woman said nothing. Sometimes silence taught better than lectures. Weeks later, Kira's class completed its field exercise, a joint medevac under simulated attack. Penelope watched from the control center, arms folded. Everything was going smoothly until a sensor failed and smoke flooded the screen. Ma'am, an instructor called. We've lost telemetry on Ellis's bird. Penelope leaned forward, switched to backup link. Static filled the speakers. Then Kira's strained voice. Control, this is Raven 9. I've got visual on the hospital site, but the evac zone's compromised. Request instructions. Another instructor started to answer, but Penelope cut in. Raven 9, this is Rogers. Abort engagement. Circle west, wait for clear signal. Static again. Then Kira's reply, hesitant. Negative, ma'am. They'll hit the compound before support arrives. Penelope's heart lurched. Lieutenant, stand down. Copy that, ma'am, Kira said after a long pause, though her tone carried the stubbornness Penelope knew too well. Seconds later, the simulator feed erupted with virtual fire. Targets destroyed. Mission saved. Instructors clapped. Kira stepped out of the pod, face flushed with pride. She saluted. Objective secured, ma'am. Penelope didn't return it. Objective failed. Kira blinked. Ma'am. You disobeyed orders. You acted alone. But it worked. So did mine, Penelope said softly, and I've been trying to undo that ever since. The room went still. Even the hum of computers seemed to fade. Penelope's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. You think victory means right. It doesn't. It just means you get to live long enough to question it. After class, Penelope found herself walking outside under gray clouds. Rain started to fall, soft, cleansing, steady. She stood in it, letting it soak through her uniform. For the first time, she understood what it meant to truly teach, not passing knowledge but passing caution. She heard footsteps behind her. Kira again. The lieutenant looked smaller now, her confidence washed away with the rain. Ma'am, she said quietly, I'm sorry. I thought if I did what you did, if I made the hard call, it would make me like you. Penelope turned slowly. Then you weren't listening. I don't want another me out there. I want someone who knows when not to be me. Kira swallowed hard. I understand. No, Penelope said gently. Not yet, but you will. She placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. Just promise me something. When the day comes and everything around you is falling apart and you have to choose between the pilot and the healer, choose the one that saves more than it destroys, even if it means doing nothing. Kira nodded, eyes wet with more than rain. I promise. Months later, the course ended. Graduation was small, quiet. Penelope gave no speech. She just handed out certificates, one by one, meeting each student's eyes with the gravity their work deserved. When it was Kira's turn, she hesitated. You'll be a good one, Penelope said. Just remember what we talked about. I will, ma'am. The lieutenant saluted sharply, but there was softness behind the gesture now, humility instead of pride. After the ceremony, Kira lingered by the hangar doors. I wanted to give you something. She handed Penelope a small metal tag. Laser-etched on one side was a single word, balance. I had it made after the exercise, Kira said. You said that's what we're all chasing. Penelope turned it over in her palm, the metal cool against her skin. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she simply said, thank you. That night, long after the base went quiet, Penelope sat in her office under a single lamp. The tag rested beside her coffee mug. She opened her old wooden box, the one filled with letters, photos, and memories she both cherished and feared, and placed the tag inside. As she closed the lid, she realized something. For the first time, the box didn't feel like a burden. It felt like history, heavy but necessary. Her phone buzzed once, an incoming text from Kira. Ma'am, deployment orders came through. I'll keep your promise. Penelope smiled faintly. Good, she whispered to the empty room. Then maybe the world's finally learning. Outside, a helicopter lifted off from the training pad, its rotors thumping softly through the night air. Penelope stepped to the window, watching its lights fade into the horizon. She felt no pull to follow, no ache of longing, only a quiet gratitude that others could fly now in her place. For years she had measured herself by the lives she'd taken, then by the lives she'd saved. But tonight she measured herself by something simpler, the lives she'd guided. Maybe that was her true mission all along. She whispered into the stillness, as if to every student, every soldier, every soul who'd ever wrestled between destruction and mercy. Courage isn't pulling the trigger, it's knowing when you don't have to. Then she turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness except for the faint glow of dawn creeping through the blinds, a new day rising for those who'd come after her. Why did the sky look too familiar? The news feed played on a muted television in the hospital lounge, desert footage, smoke rising in the distance, soldiers moving through chaos. And then she saw it. A call sign printed at the bottom corner of the live broadcast feed, Raven 9. Penelope's coffee went cold in her hand. Kira's bird. The caption read, "Ongoing evacuation under enemy fire. Allied medics pinned near border outpost." For a moment, the room around her dissolved, replaced by the scent of sand and jet fuel, by the thud of rotor blades she hadn't heard in years. Every muscle in her body froze. Someone in the lounge muttered, "That's the new Joint Med program, right? The one Rogers designed." Penelopey didn't answer. She was already walking out. 3 hours later, she was in the Pentagon again, uniform crisp but heart-pounding. Colonel Mitchell met her outside the operations center. "Don't tell me you're thinking what I think you're thinking," Mitchell said. Penelopey's jaw tightened. "That's my student out there." "And this isn't your mission anymore," Mitchell replied. "We've got command oversight. They'll handle it." Penelopey stared through the glass at the live tactical feed, the desert outpost under siege, medevac choppers circling low, gunfire flashing like heat lightning. She recognized the flight pattern instantly. Kira was piloting just like she'd trained her. Tight arcs, minimal exposure, surgical precision. "Colonel," Penelopey said softly, "she's holding her perimeter too long." Mitchell exhaled, "You're not wrong." Penelopey's voice hardened, "Get me a comm link." Mitchell hesitated, "You're not cleared for direct contact." "Then consider this personal," Penelopey said. "If she dies out there making the same mistake I did, that's on me." Moments later, she was in the comms room, headset on, surrounded by analysts tracking coordinates in real time. Her pulse synced with the chopper's rotor rhythm on the audio feed. "Raven 9, this is Guardian Command. Do you copy?" A burst of static, then a strained voice. "Guardian, this is Raven 9. Copy faint. Still engaged. 2 wounded inside compound requesting extraction window." Penelopey leaned toward the mic. "Kira, it's Rogers." Silence, then a shaky laugh. "Ma'am, what are you doing on this channel?" "Trying to keep you alive," Penelopey said. "Listen to me, you're too close to the blast zone. Pull back." "Negative, ma'am. I can hold a little longer." Penelopey's voice cut sharper. "You don't hold, you move. That's an order." Through the static, she heard Kira's breathing. "With respect, ma'am, I can't leave them." Penelopey's fingers dug into the console. "You trained for this. You know what happens if you stay too long." "I also know what happens if I leave too soon," Kira replied. The feed wavered with interference, explosions rumbling in the distance. Mitchell muttered, "She's burning fuel. She's got maybe 5 minutes." Penelopey closed her eyes. "Kira, if you die out there, you're no use to anyone. Get altitude, regroup." Another pause, then quietly, "You once told me to choose the part that saves more than it destroys. I'm trying to do that." Penelopey's throat tightened, "Then make sure it includes you." But before she could say more, the comm line crackled, then went dead. The room erupted into motion, technicians shouting coordinates, data feeds glitching. A live drone feed zoomed in on the burning outpost. Penelopey's heart stopped. A black shape lay half-submerged in the sand, rotors still spinning barely. "Impact confirmed," a text said. "Raven 9 down, secondary explosion detected." Mitchell's voice broke the noise. "We've got rescue birds en route, 20 minutes out." Penelopey stared at the feed, numb. "She doesn't have 20. And before anyone could stop her, she was already moving. 40 minutes later, she stepped off a transport plane into the furnace heat of forward base Delta. She didn't remember arguing her way onto the flight. She just remembered Mitchell's face, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant respect, as she handed her the clearance badge. "You realize what you're doing," Mitchell had said. Penelopey had just replied, "Finishing what I started." Now, as she stood before the flight line, another Apache waited. Different paint, different call sign, but the same sound that haunted her dreams. She climbed in without hesitation. The desert spread below, a living memory come to life. As she approached the crash coordinates, smoke plumed in the distance, black against a red sunset. She toggled the comm. This is Guardian 1, visual on Raven 9 site. Any survivors respond. Nothing, just static and wind. She circled lower, scanning. Then she saw it movement near the wreckage, a flare, weak but real. Penelopey exhaled sharply. Got you. She landed 50 meters away, dust swallowing the view. The heat was suffocating. She jumped down, running toward the wreck. The closer she got, the clearer the scene became. The chopper's tail section blown apart, one rotor blade embedded in the sand like a grave marker. And there, half buried under the fuselage, was Kira. Her flight suit was torn, helmet cracked, blood tracing down one side of her face, but she was conscious. Barely. When she saw Penelopey, she smiled weakly. "Ma'am, I thought you said you don't fly anymore." Penelopey dropped to her knees beside her. "I lied." It took precious minutes to free her. Every muscle in Penelopey's body screamed with effort, but she didn't stop. When Kira was finally clear, she propped her against a supply crate, checking vitals. Weak, but steady. "Where's your crew?" Penelopey asked. "Evacuated," Kira said. "I stayed to cover them." Of course she did. Gunfire cracked in the distance, closer now. The enemy had noticed the second bird. Penelopey scanned the horizon. "We're out of time." Kira tried to rise. "I can help." "No," Penelopey said sharply. "You already did." She dragged Kira toward the Apache, the weight of her student heavy in her arms. Once inside, she strapped her into the co-pilot seat. Kira's voice was faint. "You shouldn't have come." Penelopey started the engines. "Neither should you, so let's both live long enough to regret it." The rotors spun, sand lifting in violent spirals. Enemy tracers streaked the night. Penelopey banked hard left, throttle open, the chopper clawing for altitude. She'd done this before. The muscle memory was brutal, exact, alive. Only this time there was no adrenaline rush, just fierce, silent focus. Minutes later, they cleared the range. The horizon opened, endless and merciful. Kira's breathing was ragged. "Ma'am." "Don't talk," Penelopey said, glancing at her vitals on the secondary screen. "You'll be fine." "Was it worth it?" Kira whispered. Penelopey blinked. "What?" "You once said every mission's a trade. Was this one worth it?" Penelopey looked out at the setting sun. "This one," she smiled faintly. "This one's the only one that ever was." They landed at a forward field hospital just after dark. Medics swarmed in, lifting Kira onto a stretcher. Penelopey followed, silent, exhausted. As they wheeled Kira inside, the young woman caught her sleeve. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Penelopey squeezed her hand gently. "No, Lieutenant, you kept yours." Then the medics carried her away. Outside, under the desert stars, Mitchell approached from the landing strip. "You're a damn ghost, Rogers. Every time I think you're gone, you come back in a helicopter." Penelopey managed a tired smile. "Habit's hard to kill." Mitchell crossed her arms. "So is guilt." "I know," Penelopey said quietly, "but maybe this time it feels different. Maybe this time it feels like forgiveness." They stood in silence for a moment, the night wind carrying faint echoes of rotor blades fading into memory. Mitchell finally asked, "So what now?" Penelopey looked at the horizon, a faint glow of dawn beginning to rise. "Now I stop flying toward things and start flying away from them." Mitchell frowned, "Meaning?" Penelopey smiled softly, "Meaning I'm going home." Hours later, she stood outside the recovery tent where Kira slept. Machines beeped softly, the rhythm calm, steady, alive. Penelopey watched from the doorway, saying nothing. The girl's face was peaceful. Her chest rose and fell with the stubborn breath of someone who still had a future. For the first time, Penelopey didn't feel the old ache of memory pressing down. Instead, she felt something she hadn't in years: completion. She turned to leave. As she stepped out into the dawn, the sun broke the horizon. The sand glowed gold again, just like that day long ago when everything changed. Only now she wasn't chasing redemption. She'd found it. Because this time, the story didn't end in fire. It ended in life. That night back at base, she opened her notebook and wrote one final line beneath her field journal entries. Sometimes, the only way to save the next generation is to walk back into the storm that created you, not to fight it, but to show them the way out. She closed the notebook, set it aside, and finally allowed herself to sleep. Why did silence feel heavier than the war ever did? Weeks had passed since the rescue. The sand had been washed from her boots, the medals returned to their drawers, the adrenaline replaced with stillness. Penelope Rogers was home, for the first time in years, truly home. The little coastal town where she'd grown up hadn't changed much. Same diner on the corner, same harbor that smelled of salt and diesel, same morning fog that rolled in like a soft gray curtain. But she had changed. She could feel it in the way she walked slower now, in how she looked people in the eye instead of through them. Peace was supposed to feel easy. It didn't. It felt fragile. She spent her mornings walking along the shoreline, boots crunching over wet stones, the ocean wind tugging at her jacket. Sometimes she'd stop and stare at the waves breaking against the rocks, rhythmic, endless, patient. The sea didn't rush. It didn't fight. It just kept moving. One morning, an old fisherman sitting by the dock called out, "You look like someone who's seen a storm or two." Penelope smiled faintly, something like that. "Storms don't last," he said, casting his line into the surf. "But they sure teach you what holds." She nodded. He probably had no idea how true that was. At night, she often found herself back at the small desk by the window of her rented house. The same desk where she'd once written reports, debriefs, field notes. Now it held only a lamp and her old wooden box. Inside lay a collection of everything that had defined her journey: the photo of her first unit, the commendation papers, Kira's balance tag, and a folded letter she hadn't read in months, the one she'd written to whoever came after her. She unfolded it again, reading her own handwriting under the soft yellow light. If you ever find yourself faced with a choice between saving lives and taking them, remember this: both require courage, but only one will let you sleep afterward. For the first time, she smiled as she read it, not out of pride, but recognition. Those weren't words from a soldier anymore. They were words from someone finally learning how to forgive herself. Her phone buzzed one evening while she was cooking. The name on the screen stopped her mid-motion. "LT Kira Ellis." She answered immediately, "Lieutenant." A soft, raspy laugh came through the speaker. "You still sound like command, ma'am." Penelope's heart lifted. "How are you feeling?" "Still grounded," Kira said. "Doctors say I'll be back in the air in 6 months." "You're not planning to." "Relax," Kira interrupted. "Different air, medevac training only. I think I finally understand what you meant about balance." Penelope smiled, leaning against the counter. "You found your line." "I did," Kira said. "And I wanted to say thank you for everything, for coming for me." "You'd have done the same," Penelope replied. "Yeah," Kira said quietly. "That's what scares me." They both laughed softly, the kind of laughter shared between people who'd seen too much to explain. When the call ended, Penelope stood in silence for a long time, phone still in her hand, a gentle ache behind her ribs. Not pain, not regret, just the kind of emotion that comes when you realize someone else will carry the light forward and you don't need to anymore. Months turned into a year. She began teaching again, part-time, at a local university, human factors in combat medicine. Her students weren't soldiers, not yet. They were just kids with notebooks and questions. On her first day, she wrote 3 words on the board: skill, judgment, mercy. Then she turned to the class. Anyone can learn the first, the second takes time, the third takes loss. The room went silent, every eye on her. That was enough. She didn't need to tell them the rest. They figure it out when life tested them the same way she had. Sometimes letters still came from soldiers she'd saved or families who'd heard her story. They called her a hero, but that word had lost its meaning to her long ago. Heroes were flawless, untouched. She was. She was just someone who'd chosen not to look away when others needed her. One envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a photo, a group of medics standing in front of a helicopter with a painted emblem on its side, Raven Unit. Under it, a simple note. You started something that keeps us alive. We carry you with us every time we fly. Penelopey stared at it for a long time. Then she placed it inside her box, right above her old flight badge. For the first time, she realized she no longer needed to be the one flying. Her legacy already was. One foggy morning, she was sitting at the harbor café when a young journalist approached, notebook in hand. "Excuse me, are you Captain Rogers?" Penelopey sighed softly. "Was. I'm writing a piece on unsung heroes," the journalist said, hopeful. "Would you give an interview? People need to hear your story." She thought for a long moment, then shook her head gently. "The story's not about me anymore. It's about who came after." The journalist frowned. "But don't you think people should know what you did?" Penelopey smiled faintly. "They already do, they just don't know it's me, and that's the way it should be." The journalist hesitated, then said softly, "Why?" "Because real service," Penelopey said, "doesn't need a name attached. It just needs to be done." She stood, left enough money on the table for her coffee, and walked out before the next question could come. Behind her, the journalist just stared, as if trying to memorize the silhouette of someone who'd quietly shaped a generation without needing to be remembered for it. That evening she drove out to a field on the edge of town, a place she'd discovered weeks earlier, overlooking the ocean cliffs. The air was cool, filled with the low hum of distant waves. Above, stars burned sharp and clear. She spread a blanket on the grass, sat down, and tilted her head back. Somewhere faintly, she heard the distant echo of helicopter blades, maybe real, maybe imagined. It didn't matter. The sound no longer made her tense. It made her breathe. She whispered, "We made it." To who, she didn't know, maybe the ones she'd lost, maybe the ones she'd saved, maybe to herself. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of salt and jet fuel. The night was so quiet she could almost hear her heartbeat, and for the first time in forever, she wasn't thinking about what she could have done differently. She was just grateful she'd done something at all. A memory flickered in her mind, that first desperate climb into the Apache, the roar of its engines, the moment she'd realized that saving lives meant taking others, the guilt that had followed her like a shadow ever since. But guilt wasn't what she felt now. It was understanding. Understanding that war had taught her destruction, but healing had taught her grace. And between the two, she'd found her humanity again. The next morning, the tide rolled high. Sunlight broke through the mist. Penelopey watched the horizon until the last of the fog lifted. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out Kira's metal tag. Balance. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling its weight. Then slowly, she set it down on a smooth rock near the waterline. She whispered, "Time for someone else to carry it." The waves rose, touched it once, and pulled back, as if the sea itself had accepted the offering. Later that evening, as she packed her things to leave for the mainland, she opened the wooden box one last time. It was full now, not of medals or commendations, but of stories, lives, promises. She traced her fingers over each item, then closed the lid and locked it. She didn't plan to open it again. It wasn't her burden anymore. It was her proof. Proof that sometimes, the things that break you become the things that build others. As she stepped outside, a breeze lifted off the ocean. The horizon glowed with the last fire of the setting sun, deep orange fading to violet. The sound of distant rotors echoed faintly once more, and she smiled, realizing they no longer belonged to her. They belonged to those she'd trained, those she'd inspired, those still carrying on. And that was enough. She stood there for a long while, watching the sky fade into night, before whispering her final words to the wind, the words she'd spent her life earning. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And when it's done, it quietly walks away, knowing the world it left behind is still flying,